Hey everyone. Tonight we're drifting back to the American West, but not the Hollywood West. No shiny spurs. No perfectly timed pistol duels under a blazing sun. Instead, think about the actual men who spent weeks, sometimes months, on horseback, chasing cattle across endless miles of prairie. Imagine falling asleep to the creak of a saddle, the buzz of flies, and the suspicious sound of something moving in the dark. Spoiler: usually not glamorous. So let's ease into the lives of real cowboys. The dusty, sore, perpetually hungry kind. The ones who didn't have stunt doubles or John Wayne lighting. First things first, clothing. Cowboys wore what worked, not what looked good. The wide-brimmed hat, yes, that part is accurate. It kept the sun from baking their heads. It also collected rainwater in emergencies, though I wouldn't recommend drinking out of a hat if you can help it. Boots weren't polished fashion statements either. They were shaped to slide in and out of stirrups without trapping the rider. Pointy toes were less about style and more about not getting your foot jammed while a horse tried to buck you into next week. And the bandana, the eternal bandana. Not just for looking mysterious. It was a dust mask, a potholder, a sweat rag, and occasionally an improvised bandage. If you picture a cowboy without one, you're probably picturing an actor, not the real thing. Now, what about food? You'd think men riding hundreds of miles would eat like kings. Not even close. On a cattle drive, the menu was simple. And by simple, I mean depressingly repetitive. Beans, salt pork, more beans, maybe some biscuits if the cook was generous or sober. Coffee kept them awake during night watches. And it was the kind of coffee you could probably use to remove rust from an iron fence. Rotten food wasn't unusual either. Meat went bad quickly. Cowboys ate it anyway. They didn't exactly have refrigeration strapped to the side of a horse. A good cook might cover the smell with extra salt or spices. A bad cook, well, you simply hoped you survived the evening. Speaking of survival, let's talk about bandits. Hollywood paints the picture of dramatic train robberies and face-offs at high noon. Cowboys, on the other hand, worried more about someone sneaking into camp at night and quietly making off with their horses. Losing your horse on the prairie wasn't just inconvenient. It was life-threatening. Walking 50 miles in the sun with no water is less of an adventure and more of a slow, dusty disaster. So, cowboys slept light. They kept an ear tuned for rustling noise. Sometimes the camp cook, ironically the most hated man on the trail for his beans, was also the unofficial alarm system. He'd clatter pots at the first sign of trouble. Now, the horses. Let's be clear, cowboys spent more time thinking about their horses than about themselves. A cowboy could be bone-tired, half-starved, and blistered. Didn't matter. His horse ate first, drank first, and rested first. Because if the horse went down, so did the man. And those saddles you see in movies? Heavy, awkward, not designed for comfort. After a 12-hour ride, a cowboy climbed off feeling like someone had replaced his spine with a plank of wood. But you got used to it, or at least you convinced yourself you had. Romance, though. Let's be honest. Cowboys did not have time for sweeping romances under the stars. Long drives meant months without women, unless you counted the occasional rancher's daughter waving from a porch. Many cowboys were young men in their late teens or early 20s. Most were restless, broke, and sometimes on the run from responsibilities back east. That's not exactly a recipe for stable relationships. But of course, the legend grew. Ballads were sung. Stories were exaggerated. A lonely cowboy strumming a guitar under the stars sounds poetic. The reality? Mosquito bites, sore fingers, and a horse stepping on the guitar strings. And then there was the weather. The prairie wasn't gentle. It was either blistering hot or biting cold. Rainstorms turned the trail into mud that swallowed wagon wheels whole. Lightning spooked cattle, which meant stampedes. Imagine being half asleep, suddenly jerked awake by the thunder of 1,000 hooves. You'd leap on your horse in the dark, chasing panicked cattle, while praying you didn't get trampled. Sleep deprivation was part of the job description. Snow wasn't much better. Cowboys wrapped themselves in blankets and shivered through the night, trying to keep fingers and toes from freezing. Some lost them anyway. And when the firewood ran out, you burned dried cow dung. Warmth is warmth. But here's the strange thing. For all the hardship, many cowboys loved the life. They had freedom, at least in theory. The open sky. The sense that no boss was breathing down their neck, unless you counted the trail boss, and he usually was yelling. So maybe that part wasn't as freeing. Still, compared to factory work back east, the cowboy life had a rugged appeal. You were poor, yes, but you weren't stuck in a windowless room inhaling coal dust. Instead, you inhaled dust stirred up by cattle. A subtle difference. Let's drift a little into the cowboy's reputation. In the popular imagination, cowboys were all white, all heroic, all clean-cut. Not so. A significant portion were black, freedmen after the Civil War. Others were Mexican vaqueros whose traditions shaped the entire cowboy culture. And yes, some were Native American. Hollywood just edited those parts out. Cowboys weren't always law-abiding either. Some were drifters, gamblers, or petty criminals. A cattle drive might include men with shady pasts, using the job as cover. If you looked the other way while they rode beside you, they'd do the same when the sheriff asked questions. Mutual understanding kept things quiet. Daily routine was as dull as it was exhausting. Cowboys woke before dawn, ate whatever the cook burned that morning. Then they rode, and rode, and rode some more. The cattle needed to be moved steadily, never too fast. or they'd lose weight and fetch a lower price. You didn't want to explain to the rancher why his herd arrived looking like a group of underfed skeletons. So, mile after mile, cowboys kept the herd together, shouting, whistling, cracking whips, not to hurt the animals, but to guide them. A good cowboy could steer a stubborn cow with just a sharp whistle and a glare. By nightfall, they rotated shifts. Some guarded the herd, some slept. The lucky ones dreamed. The unlucky ones sat awake, straining to hear whether those distant hoofbeats were normal or the beginning of chaos. As for pay, terrible. Cowboys weren't getting rich. A drive lasting months might earn a man enough to buy new boots and a few drinks. Some blew their wages on gambling the very night they returned. Others sent money home, which probably evaporated into debts. Being a cowboy wasn't about getting rich. It was about surviving or buying time until something better came along. And then there was the constant risk. Horses stumbled, cattle kicked, guns misfired. Illness spread quickly in close quarters. A single infected tooth could be fatal. Doctors were scarce, dentists scarcer. Cowboys pulled their own teeth, usually with pliers, which is every bit as unpleasant as it sounds. Now, about guns. Yes, cowboys carried them, but not for duels in the street, mostly for defense against animals or the occasional troublemaker. Ammunition was expensive. You didn't waste it on showing off. And contrary to legend, most towns had strict laws about carrying firearms openly. The Wild West was surprisingly regulated, though many preferred to forget that part when telling stories later. So, what held all this together? The trail boss, equal parts commander, father figure, and tyrant. He decided the pace. He settled disputes. He also handed out punishments for slackers. A cowboy who fell asleep on watch might find himself assigned the worst jobs for weeks. No one liked the trail boss. Everyone depended on him anyway. Let's not forget boredom. Long rides left plenty of time for daydreaming. Cowboys told tall tales, sang songs, and played cards when they could. Jokes were repeated endlessly. Laughter, when it came, was dry and brief. The kind of humor born from exhaustion, when everything is either funny or not funny at all. And in the background, the cattle. Always the cattle. Mooing, stomping, reminding everyone that the entire operation revolved around them. So there you have it. The cowboy life wasn't glamorous. It was sore backs, bad food, cheap pay, and too much dust. But in a strange way, it carved out a piece of history that endures. When you picture a cowboy riding into the sunset, just remember, he probably smelled awful, had beans stuck in his teeth, and was desperately hoping his horse didn't limp before the next watering hole. Not quite the legend, but perhaps more interesting for it. Part 2. The royal oddities no one talks about. All right. Now that we've smelled the dust of the prairie, let's drift over to velvet curtains, gilded rooms, and the soft, persistent stench of privilege. Royals, glorious, pampered, endlessly absurd. We think of crowns, thrones, and banquets, but behind every gilded door there were strange habits, fragile health, and small, avoidable disasters. Mostly avoidable if someone had bothered to care, which, naturally, they didn't. Let's begin with a classic, the Habsburgs. The Habsburg jaw is famous. Maybe you've seen portraits. A chin that jutted so oddly, some historians suggest it made eating difficult. Now, this was not a cosmetic choice. No, this was the result of relentless inbreeding over generations. Cousins married cousins, twice removed, 3 times removed. If you looked closely, you'd see the family tree curling around itself like a confused vine. Imagine trying to attend a royal dinner, and someone literally cannot close their mouth properly while chewing. That was daily life at Habsburg tables. And yes, many children were born with various health issues. Fragile, pale, slightly droopy, but always dressed impeccably. Charles II of Spain, perhaps the pinnacle of Habsburg oddity, was, let's say, extremely delicate. He had multiple physical disabilities, struggled to walk properly, and was unable to father children. And yet he was king. He spent much of his life under the care of overworked nurses and tutors who were probably equally overworked from trying to keep him alive. Imagine attending a royal audience and seeing a man in a throne, tiny, weak, and muttering, because of course he was muttering. Meanwhile, across Europe, other royals had their quirks. Take Queen Christina of Sweden. She decided, rather firmly, that she didn't really like men, marriage, or the typical expectations of queenship. She wore men's clothing, surrounded herself with philosophers, and eventually abdicated the throne entirely. Most of Europe considered her eccentric. She probably considered them boring. And then there's Ludwig II of Bavaria, the fairy tale king. He built castles so elaborate that even builders complained they were impossible to finish. He spent lavishly, often to the point of near bankruptcy, and lived mostly alone, surrounded by art, music, and architectural fantasies. When he finally died under mysterious circumstances, it felt almost like the world sighed, relieved that someone else could finally pay the bills. Royal marriages are a different kind of peculiar entirely. You'd think marrying a cousin was odd. In the world of royalty, it was standard. Strategic alliances overruled basic biology. Sometimes these unions produced heirs. Other times, well, the heir might be sickly, weak, or just plain strange. Elizabeth of Russia had a father who married a cousin, which wasn't unusual. But the combination of genetics, court intrigue, and perhaps too many rich desserts led to children who were not robust. And then there's King William II of the Netherlands. who reportedly had a temper. Some suggest he also had digestive issues. He once threw a fit over the placement of a chair at a banquet. The court was silent, the servants terrified. But the king was king, and the chair remained, misaligned, eventually, because no one dared fix it. Let's drift to England for a moment. Henry VIII. Now, we all know the dramatic version. 6 wives, heads rolling, religious upheaval. But consider the quieter details. Henry was physically active when young, which is to say he jousted, wrestled, and ran around in heavy armor. Naturally, he also got fat, suffered leg ulcers, and generally became a royal liability later in life. By the end, he couldn't walk easily, had constant pain, and still somehow made decisions that shaped England for centuries. His wives. Well, imagine living with a man whose moods could switch from slightly bored to decapitation-level furious in a heartbeat. Catherine of Aragon endured years of Henry's temper. Anne Boleyn's story is tragic, and Jane Seymour. Brief, but she at least got to rest in peace eventually. Henry's court, like many others, operated in a constant state of tension. Protocols, etiquette, and gossip were more important than comfort. The people around him had to navigate a minefield of small gestures, polite lies, and the occasional, very literal threat to life. Sleep wasn't exactly guaranteed. And the children. Oh, the children. Royal childhoods were often peculiar, lonely, and highly regimented. Tutors, governesses, and endless formal lessons replaced playtime. Many children were sickly from a young age. Some were given strange diets meant to improve health, often with mixed results. Others were taught to speak multiple languages before they could walk properly. If that sounds exhausting, it was. Marie Antoinette's children were not exempt. Born into luxury, yet watched constantly, they had little freedom. One daughter apparently preferred dolls, which she could only play with under supervision. Another child suffered from illness, watched by worried attendants who were, ironically, powerless to help much. Childhood in these courts was a careful, controlled performance rather than a lived experience. Back to odd habits. King Charles VI of France, nicknamed Charles the Mad, had episodes where he believed he was made of glass. Yes, he thought he could shatter at any moment. The court had to be extremely careful. No sudden movements. No accidental bumps. Servants and nobles tiptoed around the king, imagining a man breaking like fine china. In retrospect, one wonders how the royal budget accounted for shattered dignity or actual damage. And then there's Emperor Norton of America, technically not royal in the traditional sense, but amusing nonetheless. He declared himself Emperor of the United States in the 19th century. He had no actual power, but the citizens of San Francisco treated him politely. Some even gave him free meals. He issued decrees, which were largely ignored. He spent his days in elaborate uniforms, wandering the city streets, a kind of honorary royalty whose eccentricities were tolerated because, well, he wasn't actually harming anyone. Let's meander toward the Victorian era. Queen Victoria herself was famously grumpy. She mourned her husband for decades, sometimes to the point of paranoia. She hated leaving Windsor Castle, which she referred to as home in a way that suggested nothing outside was trustworthy. And yet, she had 9 children. Each child was married strategically, producing grandchildren who would spread across Europe like royalty tends to do. Genetics aside, she maintained strict moral and social codes. Her household was controlled down to what time one coughed, what time one ate, and how curtains should hang. Sleep schedules for staff were often sacrificed in the name of decorum. And we can't ignore the little petty decisions that shaped history. Take Tsar Paul I of Russia. He became obsessed with military drills, even in his palace corridors. Courtiers were forced to march, line up, salute, and otherwise obey rituals that made little sense outside of his mind. Eventually, they decided it was easier to remove him from power. This is why one must always be careful when enforcing arbitrary marching orders. Or George IV of England. He spent massive sums on jewelry, architecture, and himself. He detested his wife, Caroline, but adored entertaining, clothes, and opulent parties. His life was a mix of indulgence, drama, and digestive discomfort. Like many royals, he was simultaneously admired and quietly mocked. In summary, the lives of the elite were a combination of privilege, absurdity, and constant, low-grade misery. Food might be exquisite, clothing expensive, and rooms lavish, but the rules, the public scrutiny, the fragile health, and the endless chain of inherited weirdness made it complicated. Sleepy, fragile, often bored, and occasionally terrifying. The royals of Europe and beyond were human after all. Just humans with crowns, chronic indigestion, and a tendency to marry their cousins. Part 3. Fragile bloodlines and petty royal meltdowns. All right, let's settle deeper into the world of dynasties, distant castles, and occasionally horrifying portraits. Because, naturally, history insists on keeping the uncomfortable details alive for our quiet contemplation. We begin with the Medici of Florence. Powerful, wealthy, occasionally brilliant, and often genetically adventurous. Not in the fun sense. Inbreeding was a family pastime. Cousins married cousins. Uncles married nieces. Sometimes it was strategic. Sometimes just a convenient way to keep property within the family. The result? Fragile heirs, strange appearances, and a court full of hushed whispers. And then there was poor Alessandro de' Medici. He became Duke of Florence in the 16th century, known for being charming, yet constantly under threat from relatives who wanted his position. A mixture of intrigue, distrust, and occasionally extravagant parties, because why not, made his life complicated. Tragically, he didn't survive long, and his demise was rather abrupt. Politics, family ambition, and sharp blades were unforgiving. Let's drift a little northward. The Danish and Norwegian royals of the 17th century had their own peculiarities. King Christian IV of Denmark, a long-reigning monarch, was fascinated by architecture, expansion, and, perhaps, indulgence in food and drink. His life was full of careful planning, endless construction projects, and small personal dramas. His children inherited health issues, mostly minor, though sometimes serious enough to cause quiet alarm at court. Imagine the stress of running a country while also wondering if your heir will survive the next winter. And speaking of fragile heirs, let's visit Spain again. The Spanish Habsburgs, we touched on Charles too, but consider his ancestors. They married close relatives repeatedly. The results, over generations, were predictable. Weak teeth, deformed jaws, epilepsy, and fragile bones were common. Courtiers whispered politely about appearances. Doctors experimented timidly. And the general public? They mostly worried about taxes, wars, and whether the king could produce an heir. He could. Barely. It's quietly funny, in a tragic sense, that generations of careful planning to maintain power genetically backfired. That is history's subtle irony. Moving west, France had its fair share of oddities. Louis XIV, the Sun King, was meticulous about everything: etiquette, hairstyles, the precise angle at which one knee bent when bowing. He also had an unusual relationship with personal comfort. Elaborate wigs, restrictive clothing, and a court that existed to marvel at his every move. Naturally, his children inherited both elegance and health problems. One son, the Grand Dauphin, lived a comparatively long life, but his health was delicate, and the stress of court life weighed on him heavily. Louis XV, his descendant, inherited some charm, but also chronic ailments. Gout, obesity, and poor eyesight plagued him. Despite that, he made decisions that often worsened the lives of others, while quietly ignoring his own discomfort. And yes, there were mistresses, always mistresses. The royal court treated them as both scandalous and inevitable. Odd habits? Plenty. King Frederick II of Prussia, also known as Frederick the Great, insisted on eating alone at long tables, with only music for company. He wrote letters while eating. He played the flute while dinner was served. He was brilliant in military strategy, but socially awkward. Courtiers tiptoed around his peculiar routines, trying not to draw attention to small missteps, which were often punished with subtle disdain or blunt sarcasm, Frederick's style. And let's not ignore the pettiness. Queen Anne of England, who reigned in the early 18th century, was both intelligent and fragile. She suffered repeated personal tragedies. Many children died young. She had health problems that made public appearances difficult. Despite this, her court squabbled constantly, nobles maneuvered for influence, and the queen herself sometimes found herself embroiled in minor disputes that had enormous consequences. A misplaced letter or misunderstood gesture could set off weeks of political tension. The contrast between immense responsibility and personal frailty is what makes her story quietly compelling. Now, let's wander back to Germany. Charles VI, Holy Roman Emperor, father of Maria Theresa, insisted on producing a male heir. His obsession with succession shaped policy, alliances, and marriages across Europe. Meanwhile, his personal life, he suffered from insomnia, stomach problems, and the general misery of overwork, was less dramatic in the public eye, but equally consuming. He may have been one of the first rulers to understand that sleep deprivation and statecraft do not mix well. Maria Theresa herself, despite being a formidable ruler, had 16 children. 16, and each was carefully married to strengthen dynastic ties. Some children were healthy, some frail. The family portraits show smiles that mask both exhaustion and quiet anxiety. Children, after all, can't be entirely controlled, even by monarchs. And here's a curious detail. Many royals developed eccentric routines to cope. Catherine the Great of Russia, for example, had a strict morning routine. She rose early, exercised, and read extensively. Her health was surprisingly robust for a woman in her 60s who had given birth to numerous children. Yet, she also spent time composing letters filled with biting sarcasm toward her enemies, letters that historians love because they reveal both wit and exhaustion from court politics. Some habits were stranger still. King Charles VI of France, no relation to the Holy Roman Emperor Charles VI, reportedly had periods of madness in which he believed he was made of glass. Yes, again, a literal belief in shattering. Servants were warned to avoid physical contact. Noblemen tiptoed through halls, and the king's life became a careful ballet of avoidance. Daily life in such courts was a strange mix of politeness and tension, where everyone had to pretend the absurd was reasonable, and the minor tragedies pile up. Infant mortality was high, even for kings and queens. Babies were fragile, sometimes born with deformities, sometimes simply failing to thrive. Parents watched, worried, and occasionally resigned themselves to fate. Funeral arrangements became almost routine. Mourning periods were formalized. Courtiers were expected to participate with equal parts sorrow and decorum. Sleep, again, was often sacrificed to grief and ceremony. We could also drift into the quieter humiliations. Queen Victoria, despite her power, endured endless protocol. She disliked leaving Windsor Castle, yet she had to attend events. She mourned Prince Albert for decades, even as her children, well-meaning, sometimes irritating children, continued their own lives. The daily grind of monarchy was relentless, mixing grief, boredom, and obligation. And yet, the public adored her, or at least pretended to. And finally, let's consider petty meltdowns. George IV, as we touched on, was prone to temperamental decisions. He could explode over minor slights, a misaligned chair, a slightly off painting, a dish served too late. The court learned quickly that discretion, flattery, and careful observation were survival skills. Similarly, Emperor Paul I of Russia's obsession with drills eventually led to his untimely removal. Small personal obsessions could have enormous consequences in royal life. So, as we drift away from crowns, wigs, and silk slippers, the pattern emerges. Privilege is constant, but so is fragility. Wealth and power do not guarantee health, happiness, or common sense. The more elaborate the hairstyle, the more likely someone has secretly lost sleep over succession, illness, or a minor furniture dispute. It's a quietly sobering observation, and, in a strangely comforting way, a reminder that even kings and queens, those seemingly untouchable figures, were human, vulnerable, exhausted, occasionally irrational, and often entirely incapable of controlling everything around them. Part 4. Sickly, spoiled, and odd royal childhoods. All right. Now we settle into cradles, nurseries, and gilded playrooms. Because if adulthood in royalty was peculiar, childhood was often quietly miserable. Royal children were not raised like ordinary kids. Toys existed, yes, but mostly as tools to display status. Dolls were porcelain, beautifully crafted, and frequently lethal if thrown. Play often required supervision by a governess, tutor, or occasionally a physician. Yes, even playtime was regimented. Health was a constant concern. Infant mortality was high. Children could fall ill with something as simple as a cold, and it might turn serious quickly. Royals often had private physicians, but medicine in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries was unreliable. Bloodletting, herbal concoctions, and enforced diets were common remedies. Some children were given strange mixtures to strengthen them, milk boiled with wine, herbs that were more likely to make a child vomit than thrive. Louis XIV of France, the Sun King, lost several siblings in infancy. His mother, Anne of Austria, watched carefully, surrounded by doctors and attendants. Every cough, sneeze, or fuss required evaluation. No one could afford to ignore illness, because heirs were not just children, they were the future of the kingdom. And then there was the pressure of education. Young royals were expected to learn multiple languages. By the age of 6, it wasn't unusual for a prince or princess to read French, Latin, and Italian. Mathematics, etiquette, and history were part of the daily schedule. Play and creativity were tolerated only if they did not interfere with lessons. Imagine trying to be a 6-year-old forced to memorize treaties, grammar, and moral codes. all while maintaining a poised expression. The occasional tantrum was sometimes inevitable, and when tantrums occurred, they were rarely tolerated. Nannies and tutors often had to employ both patience and subtle manipulation to restore order. Diet was another peculiar aspect. Royal children often ate health-promoting foods that were neither tasty nor reliable. Boiled meats, bread soaked in wine, and an overabundance of herbs were common. Sweets were reserved for special occasions. Hydration came primarily from watered-down juices or herbal teas. The goal, naturally, was to create a healthy heir, but sometimes the result was a frail, oddly pale child who longed for a stolen piece of fruit. Sleep schedules were rigid. Nap time existed, but not on the child's terms. Beds were often ornate and uncomfortable. Servants might be stationed nearby to monitor movement, breathing, and compliance with the sleep schedule. Too much rest was frowned upon. Too little punished. Children who resisted often developed interesting personalities. Some became stubborn, others shy, and a few, tragically, were both. And there were always tutors. A young prince or princess might have multiple teachers simultaneously, one for religion, one for mathematics, one for languages, one for etiquette. Some tutors were brilliant, others petty. Some loved their charges, others despised them. A royal child, as a result, learned very early that flattery, obedience, and selective honesty were survival skills. Maria Theresa of Austria, for example, was educated intensively by her father, Charles VI. She mastered several languages, geography, history, and even military strategy. At the age of 13, she could negotiate treaties, which is impressive and probably exhausting. Childhood for her was a mixture of rigorous schooling, social expectation, and constant observation. Eccentricities emerged early. Louis XIV, as a child, was already aware of court expectations. He had to practice walking gracefully, bowing properly, and managing his expressions. Deviate slightly, and a tutor might correct him. The boy who would become the Sun King spent much of his early years learning to perform humanity rather than simply enjoy it. Queen Victoria, likewise, had a strict upbringing. Her mother and her advisor, the formidable Baroness Lezen, monitored every aspect of her life. Letters suggest Victoria was intensely curious, yet often frustrated. She was given lessons in history, languages, and decorum simultaneously. Playtime, again, was supervised and educational. Now, let's drift into slightly darker territory. Some royal children were simply unlucky. Charles II of Spain, as we mentioned, was born into a lineage of extreme inbreeding. His childhood was full of medical interventions, constant observation, and frail health. He survived when many might not have, but the cost was visible in every portrait. Pale, weak, fragile, and remarkably delicate, He carried the weight of dynastic expectations while battling physical limitations. The irony, of course, is that careful breeding meant to maintain power often resulted in the opposite: heirs too sickly to rule effectively. History is full of these quiet, tragic examples. And yet, amidst the fragility, there was some indulgence. Royal children were often spoiled in small ways. Toys, jewels, and clothing were lavish. They had servants to attend every whim, but indulgence rarely replaced structure. A child could have the finest toy, yet still be scolded for eating with the wrong hand, speaking incorrectly, or failing to memorize a lesson. Spoiled, yes, but never free. Some children develop peculiar routines or obsessions. Frederick the Great, as a boy, was reportedly passionate about music and poetry, much to the dismay of his father. His strict father, Frederick William I, preferred military discipline above all. The young Frederick was forced to endure drills, punishments, and public humiliation for pursuing artistic interests. Eventually, he fled briefly, only to return as the brilliant, eccentric king we now know. Early childhood disappointment shaped him, but also refined his intellect and resilience. Then there are the minor tragedies of siblings. Royal families were large, often more than a dozen children. Competition, jealousy, illness, and death were constant companions. A child might lose a sibling to disease, fall behind in lessons, or feel isolated amid the chaos of the palace. Emotional neglect wasn't unusual, though it was quiet, polite, and almost invisible to the outside observer. And the paradox of privilege. Royal children had more resources than almost anyone else on the planet. Private tutors, physicians, luxurious surroundings. Yet, in many ways, they were imprisoned by expectations. Freedom was measured in small increments. A walk in the garden, a permitted conversation, a brief moment away from a tutor's watchful eye. The larger world remained largely inaccessible. Eccentric habits also arose from these constraints. Some children became obsessed with rituals, arranging toys in a precise order, insisting on repeated actions before meals, or meticulously practicing bows and curtsies. Others retreated into books, music, or quiet observation. A few, as with Charles VI of France, developed unusual beliefs or fears, believing, for example, that one could shatter like glass. Early confinement, health anxieties, and endless expectations created fertile ground for idiosyncrasies. And then came adolescence. The transition from childhood to adulthood was swift and often harsh. Royal teenagers were expected to take on responsibilities, participate in diplomacy, and learn about the burdens of rule. Mistakes were magnified, failures scrutinized, opportunities limited by duty and genetics alike. A teenage prince could be brilliant, yet under constant threat of ridicule or political misstep. A princess might excel in education, only to be married off to someone she had never met, securing alliances while sacrificing personal choice. Finally, the quiet melancholy of it all. Royal childhoods were often lonely, constrained, and fragile. The combination of privilege and expectation created both remarkable individuals and tragic figures. Some thrived, some survived, and some simply existed under the weight of their titles, bloodlines, and courtly rules. Yet, even in this, there is a strange beauty. Observing how these children navigated strictures, illness, and eccentric caretakers gives us a unique lens into the humanity behind crowns and castles. Vulnerable, often misunderstood, and occasionally absurd, they remind us that history is not just grand battles and treaties. It is also small sighs, whispered frustrations, and carefully concealed tears in gilded nurseries. Part 5. Peculiar Adult Lives Habits, Obsessions, and Quiet Tragedies. All right, now that we've explored the fragility of royal childhoods, let's gently wander into adulthood. Because the peculiarities don't disappear. They merely evolve. Royal adulthood was a delicate balancing act. Power, etiquette, obligation, and sometimes bizarre personal quirks. And while these individuals were immensely privileged, their lives were often constrained by ritual, expectation, and occasionally eccentricity. Take Peter, the Great of Russia. He modernized an entire country, yes, but personally. He was unconventional, to say the least. He walked the streets incognito to observe his subjects, often behaving in ways that startled onlookers. He enjoyed practical jokes, often cruel, and he insisted on personally inspecting ships, fortresses, and workshops. His obsession with progress was admirable, but it often bordered on obsession with control. Courtiers learned quickly to anticipate his whims or suffer minor humiliation. Sleep, predictably, was intermittent. Then there's Queen Christina of Sweden, whom we touched on briefly. Adult life only amplified her eccentricity. She preferred philosophical discussion over dining, scholars over courtly entertainment, and wore men's clothing with such devotion that her court eventually adapted. When she abdicated, she moved to Rome, continued her intellectual pursuits, and generally ignored the world's expectation that a former queen behave in a more conventional fashion. Royal hobbies could be remarkably intense. Louis XIV of France, for instance, obsessed over dance. Ballet wasn't just entertainment, it was a form of statecraft. He performed publicly, expecting flawless execution. Courtiers practiced tirelessly, sometimes in pain, to meet his exacting standards. Yet, despite these rigid expectations, he also indulged in lavish parties, extended meals, and an astonishing wardrobe. Obsession and indulgence walked hand in hand, and some habits were quietly tragic. George IV of England, for example, spent enormous sums on clothing, art, and architecture, while his health steadily declined. Obesity, gout, and digestive issues plagued him. Socially, He was both admired and ridiculed, a man caught between public expectation and private indulgence. His daily routine often involved long periods of inactivity, punctuated by bursts of social energy for ceremonial events. The contrast between physical discomfort and social obligation must have been exhausting. Royal obsessions extended to animals as well. Catherine the Great of Russia adored her horses. She took meticulous care of them, rode daily, and maintained stables that rivaled minor, noble households. Similarly, Queen Victoria enjoyed pets, especially dogs, and maintained a degree of attachment that was both endearing and socially conspicuous. Animals often provided comfort where human relationships were formal or politically constrained. Some obsessions were less harmless. Charles II of Spain, in adulthood, struggled with fragile health and poor mobility, largely a result of his inbred lineage. His obsessions involved rituals designed to protect himself, sitting carefully to avoid injury, precise eating routines, and controlled interaction with courtiers. These small routines were often critical for survival, but might have seemed eccentric to casual observers. And let's drift to daily routines, which could be rigid or peculiar. Frederick the Great of Prussia maintained strict schedules, meals at precise times, work punctuated by exercise and music, and evenings devoted to reading or correspondence. He rose early, ate alone, and often spent hours immersed in writing or reflection. Courtiers and staff adapted, learning the rhythms of his habits. Any deviation could produce subtle displeasure or mild chaos in the court. Personal indulgences could also become politically visible. Napoleon Bonaparte, for instance, was obsessed with maps. He carried them constantly, studied troop movements relentlessly, and maintained an extraordinary awareness of European geography. His obsession influenced decisions at all levels of government, and yet, in private, he enjoyed simple pleasures, good food, quiet walks, and occasional humor. These small indulgences humanized an otherwise imposing figure. And of course, royals often had minor, sometimes absurd fears. King Charles VI of France believed he was made of glass. Tsar Paul I of Russia feared conspiracies and ritualistically inspected everything in his palace. Queen Victoria reportedly disliked being disturbed in her private chambers and developed strict household routines. Such fears and habits were tolerated or indulged by those around them because, ultimately, disagreement with the sovereign could have unpleasant consequences. Odd personal rituals were common. Some monarchs had extremely detailed morning routines, exacting dress codes, or even peculiar methods of measuring time and space in their chambers. Catherine the Great exercised daily, maintained a precise diet, and wrote extensive letters filled with wit and mild cruelty. These habits sustained her, structured her life, and subtly reinforced her authority. Let's consider eccentric indulgences. George IV was fond of lavish balls, intricate fashions, and interior design. His obsession with comfort sometimes bordered on ridiculous, custom-made furniture, endlessly elaborate meals, and extended leisure activities. Yet he remained a figure of authority, a living paradox of indulgence and responsibility. Louis XV enjoyed hunting obsessively. He treated hunts as both sport and social theater. Courtiers and servants followed rigid schedules to accommodate these pursuits. Health, practicality, and even the logistics of feeding the animals were secondary to the king's passion. And then there were the quieter eccentricities. Queen Victoria kept detailed journals, adhered to strict mourning rituals, and established household routines that governed dozens of staff. Her attention to small details, curtains, furniture, meal schedules, was both practical and obsessive. And for her, the weight of duty often coincided with a profound sense of personal grief after the death of Prince Albert. Personal tragedies were subtle but omnipresent. Children died young. Illness struck unexpectedly. Courtiers schemed. Family conflicts simmered. Royals, despite wealth and privilege, were never free from suffering. Their responses often took the form of habits, routines, or eccentricities, small ways to impose order on a life of political and personal uncertainty. And of course, romantic lives were rarely simple. Marriages were political. Love was secondary. Affairs were tolerated if discreet. Children were born according to duty rather than affection. Even in private moments, pleasure and personal desire were carefully mediated by expectation and precedent. Royals rarely lived entirely for themselves. Their desires were always balanced against public perception, dynastic necessity, and health. Sleep, unsurprisingly, remained inconsistent. Heavy schedules, chronic illnesses, and social obligations ensured that few slept as they might wish. Naps, early rising, or short evening rests were all they could manage. Insomnia, chronic pain, and the stress of constant observation were recurring companions. Yet, somehow, governance continued. History remembers laws, treaties, and architecture. Less often does it capture the yawns, stiff joints, and mild irritability of monarchs attempting to maintain composure. So, as we drift through these quietly peculiar adult lives, a pattern emerges. Eccentricity is natural. Privilege doesn't eliminate fragility. Ritual, obsession, and habit are coping mechanisms for power and expectation. Even the most powerful humans are constrained by biology, psychology, and circumstance. Crowns may shine, thrones may gleam, and robes may rustle. But beneath it all, fatigue, anxiety, and personal oddities persist. Part 6. Royal marriages gone wrong, genetics, politics, and quiet tragedy. All right, let's settle into the quiet, perfumed halls of matrimonial misadventure. Because if childhood and eccentric adulthood were tricky, Marriages in royalty were quietly catastrophic. Royal unions were rarely about love. They were contracts, alliances, and strategies to consolidate power. Hearts, desires, and personalities were secondary, and sometimes these arrangements produced outcomes that were both biologically unfortunate and socially awkward. Take the Habsburgs again, because they really excelled in this field. Charles II of Spain, the culmination of generations of cousin-on-cousin marriage, was famously frail and unable to produce an heir. His parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents had carefully arranged unions to preserve wealth and territory, and ended up with a child who could barely walk, chew, or survive without constant care. It's a quiet testament to the risks of inbreeding. His court, of course, performed its best impression of cheerfulness. Officials nodded politely, doctors whispered nervously, and Europe watched, waiting to see if the line would survive. It did not. Meanwhile, in France, Louis XIV married Maria Theresa of Spain, a union meant to cement peace between two major powers. Political logic aside, the marriage was rather dull. Maria Theresa had a quiet, compliant nature. Louis XIV, by contrast, was charismatic, demanding, and often distracted by mistresses. The children produced were numerous, but their health and temperament varied widely. Some thrived, others were weak, sickly, or tragically unremarkable. Court gossip filled the silence with whispered judgment, polite scandal, and occasional relief that everyone was still alive. In England, royal marriages could be equally perplexing. George III married Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, a woman described as intelligent, diligent, and highly dutiful. She bore 15 children, which is impressive, but George's later mental health struggles, combined with the sheer scale of their progeny, created household tension. Children were numerous, education was regimented, and personal freedom was minimal. Love was present, in a sense, but heavily mediated by duty and expectation. Let's drift northward. The Danish and Norwegian courts occasionally produced tragic pairings. Royals married for alliance, not affection. Children were fragile. In some cases, cultural differences, personal habits, and court customs clashed, creating mild domestic misery and occasional political embarrassment. These marriages were quietly disastrous, yet still considered successes if they preserved property and influence. And of course, there were minor scandals. Louis XV of France had a famously complicated romantic life. Marriages, mistresses, illegitimate children, all coexisted. His wife, Marie Leczinska, endured the situation with dignity, if not enthusiasm. Their children survived, mostly, but the household atmosphere was a careful dance of tolerance, observation, and subtle avoidance. Then there's Austria. Maria Theresa arranged marriages for her children that were politically brilliant, but sometimes personally challenging. Her daughter Marie Antoinette, for instance, was married to Louis XVI of France to secure alliance. Young, foreign, and culturally naive, she struggled to adapt to French court life. The marriage was legally binding, socially strategic, and personally isolating. Children followed, health was fragile, and political pressures mounted quietly but relentlessly. Some unions were biologically unfortunate. Inbreeding in European royalty was common. Cousins married cousins, nephews married nieces, distant relations married for convenience. The results varied. Some heirs were robust, others frail, and a few, like Charles II of Spain, were tragically weakened by generations of repeated patterns. Courtiers whispered, physicians experimented, and life quietly persisted under gilded ceilings. Oddly, some misalliances were socially awkward rather than biologically dangerous. Henry VIII, for instance, married Catherine of Aragon for political alliance. Initially successful, the union became strained due to Henry's desire for a male heir. Catherine was intelligent, dutiful, and unable to fulfill this particular demand biologically. Henry's solution, of course, involved new marriages, annulments, and, eventually, public drama of a magnitude rarely matched. Court life must have been exhausting, with staff alternating between loyalty and terror. And sometimes, politics dictated the strangest personal dynamics. Charles VI, Holy Roman Emperor, arranged marriages for his children primarily to secure alliances. He worried obsessively about succession. Yet, in private, he suffered insomnia, chronic pain, and low-grade anxiety. The juxtaposition of grand political ambition and fragile personal reality was quietly tragic, yet profoundly human. Odd habits also influenced marital outcomes. Frederick the Great of Prussia married reluctantly. He was more interested in music, philosophy, and military strategy than conjugal harmony. The arranged union produced children but little affection. Social expectation mandated appearances and public duty, yet personal satisfaction remained elusive. Such marriages, quietly dysfunctional, were considered successful if they produced heirs. Sometimes, tragedy was subtle. Prince George of Denmark, husband to Queen Anne of England, was reportedly sickly from the start. His marriage was politically useful, personally steady, and emotionally restrained. Yet he suffered chronic illness, early death, and a court unable to reconcile his fragility with the demands of monarchy. Behind protocol and ceremony, life was quietly hard. And then there were the eccentric unions. Queen Christina of Sweden, as we discussed, never married. Her abdication allowed her to live independently, study, and socialize with philosophers. Her life provides a gentle contrast to the many royals trapped in politically expedient but personally unfulfilling marriages. She chose intellectual freedom over dynastic duty, a quietly rebellious act in an era obsessed with heirs. So, in summary, Royal marriages were rarely about love. They were contracts, often biologically risky, socially awkward, and emotionally constrained. Heirs, health, and alliances mattered far more than affection or personal happiness. Yet, within this rigid framework, individuals sometimes carved small freedoms, eccentric habits, or private joys, tiny islands of humanity in a sea of duty. Part 7. Daily Absurdities, Eccentric Hobbies, and Minor Meltdowns. All right, now that we've meandered through childhood fragility, eccentric adulthoods, and disastrous marriages, let's settle into the quieter, everyday quirks of royals. These small details, subtle obsessions, and minor catastrophes make history oddly intimate and quietly amusing. Take George IV of England again. His life, as we noted, was punctuated by indulgence. But daily routines were equally peculiar. He reportedly inspected his wardrobe each morning in detail, ensuring everything matched perfectly. Clothing wasn't just functional, it was a symbol, a statement, and, occasionally, a source of mild panic if anything was out of order. Courtiers, servants, and tailors quickly learned that minor mistakes could provoke disproportionate responses. And it wasn't only clothing. Food often became a source of eccentricity. Louis XIV of France had extremely specific meal preferences. Certain dishes were forbidden at certain times. Meals were timed precisely. Guests had to behave appropriately, or risk offending the king. Yet, even amidst this rigid system, occasional indulgence occurred, a sweet treat, a private feast, a brief relaxation before courtly duties resumed. These small pleasures offered a quiet reprieve from the relentless attention monarchy demanded. Exercise, naturally, could be equally absurd. Catherine the Great rode horses daily, supervising stables, engaging with the animals, and personally attending to their needs. For a modern observer, it may seem excessive. For Catherine, it was both pleasure and control, a way to impose order in an otherwise unpredictable life. Animals often became a reliable source of affection when human relationships were complicated by politics or expectation. Then there were minor ceremonial crises. Charles VI of France, with his glass delusion, required attendants to handle him with extreme care. Small missteps, dropping a utensil, bumping furniture, or accidentally touching him could provoke panic. Courtiers learned subtle ways to navigate his whims. Protocols became elaborate, absurdly precise, yet entirely necessary to maintain calm. The daily rhythm of life was a quiet dance of anticipation, patience, and mild dread. Even rulers without psychological delusions had eccentric routines. Frederick the Great of Prussia woke early, ate alone, and spent hours on music, letters, or reflection. His courtiers adapted to his schedule, knowing that deviation could create mild chaos. Small personal obsessions, like exact meal times or precise seating arrangements, were not only tolerated, but institutionalized, quietly shaping the structure of the entire court. Louis XVI of France hunted obsessively. George IV collected art, curated furniture, and oversaw extravagant parties. Catherine the Great indulged in reading, music, and elaborate correspondence. Napoleon Bonaparte, despite immense responsibilities, enjoyed simple pleasures, walks, letters, and strategic games with close advisors. Hobbies provided structure, amusement, and a small sense of control in lives dominated by duty, expectation, and public scrutiny. Minor meltdowns, of course, were unavoidable. Queen Victoria could be abruptly irritable, sometimes over minor breaches of etiquette or household management. George III occasionally lashed out due to mental instability or chronic pain. Louis XIV could become visibly frustrated during rehearsals or formal events. These reactions were often contained, polite, and ritualized, but still deeply human. The juxtaposition of authority and human frailty created a quiet tension, observable only to those living within the court. Even writing letters became an exercise in eccentricity. Catherine the Great composed lengthy, witty, and occasionally scathing letters to correspondents, diplomats, and acquaintances. The letters were carefully crafted, revealing both intellect and personal nuance. Similarly, Queen Victoria maintained extensive correspondence, providing insight into daily routines, personal feelings, and occasional grievances. These written records capture small but telling details: preferred tea times, minor frustrations, subtle joys, and private observations of people around them. Sleep, unsurprisingly, remained a recurring theme. Insomnia, irregular hours, and ceremonial obligations ensured that few monarchs slept as they might prefer. Short naps, interrupted rest, and inconsistent routines were common. Even small irritations, a misaligned curtain, a slightly off chair, or a delayed meal could disrupt comfort. Yet life went on. Governance continued. Policy was enacted. History quietly persisted amid yawns and stiff joints. Pets, as we mentioned, provided comfort. Dogs, horses, and even exotic animals often became companions. George IV adored his spaniels. Catherine the Great's stables were meticulously maintained. Louis XIV maintained elaborate menageries. Animals offered reliability, predictability, and a source of affection that human relationships often lacked due to protocol, politics, or personal eccentricity. And finally, let's consider the quiet humor. Royal diaries, letters, and accounts reveal subtle amusement, gentle sarcasm, and understated wit. Charles VI's attendants reportedly described the glass episodes with careful understatement. Maria Theresa occasionally commented on the eccentricities of her children and court. Queen Victoria's journals contain dry observations of courtiers' foibles. Humor, even when quiet, was a coping mechanism in lives otherwise constrained by expectation. So, what do these minor absurdities reveal? Even the most powerful humans are constrained by biology, psychology, and circumstance. Crowns shine, thrones gleam, and robes rustle, but beneath it all, fatigue, anxiety, small rituals, and eccentric habits persist. The grand narrative of history is punctuated by minor crises, unusual routines, and subtle quirks. These details remind us that monarchs were, after all, human, fragile, fallible, occasionally irrational, and oddly comforting to observe from a safe distance. Part 8. Gentle reflections on fragility, eccentricity, and history. All right, now that we've meandered through childhoods, marriages, minor meltdowns, and eccentric routines, let's pause and reflect. There is something quietly comforting in observing history from a gentle distance, especially the human foibles hidden behind crowns, thrones, and ceremonial robes. History often remembers rulers for wars, treaties, or architectural achievements. But beneath the grand events lie small, persistent truths. Humans are fragile, curious, eccentric, and occasionally absurd. Monarchs, despite immense privilege, were no exception. Their lives were structured by duty, constrained by expectation, and peppered with minor absurdities. Yet, within these constraints, we glimpse resilience, wit, and quiet humanity. Consider the fragile health of many royals. Infant mortality, chronic illness, and genetic fragility shape their lives. Charles II of Spain, Charles VI of France, and numerous Habsburg descendants bore the consequences of generations of dynastic planning. Yet they persevered, albeit often quietly and with difficulty. Their fragility reminds us that no title, crown, or fortune can fully protect against the vulnerability inherent in being human. Eccentricity, too, was a natural response. Peter the Great wandered incognito to observe his people. Frederick the Great obsessed over schedules, music, and minor rituals. Catherine the Great maintained her stables and correspondence with meticulous devotion. These habits, sometimes amusing, sometimes bizarre, provided structure and relief in lives dominated by duty and expectation. They were coping mechanisms, reflections of personality, and small islands of control. And the absurdities, the minor meltdowns, obsessive routines, and delicate fears offer subtle humor. George IV inspected wardrobes obsessively. Charles VI feared shattering. Louis XIV demanded perfect ballet execution. Courtiers tiptoed, servants whispered, and physicians experimented. Observing these small crises, it's hard not to smile quietly at the persistence of human quirks. History, in these moments, is surprisingly relatable. Even marriages, so carefully arranged, often produced irony. Political alliances dictated unions, yet personal happiness frequently lagged behind duty. Health, temperament, and personality didn't always align with dynastic expectations. Charles II could barely produce an heir. Marie Antoinette struggled with her foreign court. George III managed numerous children amidst chronic stress. Love, desire, and affection were secondary to duty, yet humans inevitably sought small comforts where possible. And through it all, subtle humor emerges. Letters reveal wit, journals hint at irony, and minor anecdotes capture understated absurdity. Maria Theresa commented dryly on her children. Catherine the Great skewered acquaintances with pen and ink. Queen Victoria noted courtly mishaps with gentle sarcasm. Humor, restrained and quiet, was a companion through the often exhausting rituals of monarchy. So, what do we take from these softly whispered histories? Privilege does not eliminate vulnerability. Power does not eradicate eccentricity. Titles do not prevent fatigue, illness, or minor frustration. Monarchs, like everyone else, lived with routines, obsessions, disappointments, and small joys. They navigated duty, expectation, and fragility with persistence, occasional wit, and sometimes gentle absurdity. Their lives, viewed calmly and patiently, remind us that humanity persists, even amid crowns, thrones, and silk slippers. And perhaps that is the quiet magic of history. We often think of it as grand, monumental, and distant. But if we pause, observe, and drift gently into the details, the minor crises, eccentricities, and personal habits, we see humans who are strikingly familiar. Fragile, curious, occasionally irrational, and quietly persevering. History becomes less a series of events and more a tapestry of lives, small habits, and subtle humor. The crowns glimmer, the thrones gleam, and yet beneath it all lies a quietly human story, waiting to be noticed and quietly appreciated. So, as you lie back, dim the lights, and allow these whispers of history to settle, remember, the greatest figures of the past were human, just like you. They worried, they laughed, they endured, and sometimes they melted down over minor absurdities. And perhaps, in that gentle reflection, we find a kind of comfort, knowing that fragility, curiosity, and eccentricity are timeless companions.